The UK housing market just pulled off something nobody saw coming. After months of doom and gloom predictions, house prices have suddenly jumped by the biggest margin we've seen in 2 years. Right now, while you're watching this, the average property value has climbed to £268,000. That's a jump of almost £4,000 in just 1 month. Estate agents are scrambling, buyers are panicking, and sellers are celebrating. But before you think this is the comeback story everyone's been waiting for, there's something lurking beneath these numbers that changes everything. If you want to stay ahead of what's really happening in the UK property market and economy, hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter, because we're cutting through the noise to bring you the truth. The latest data from Nationwide has just dropped, and the numbers are staggering. We're looking at a 1.4% monthly increase in property values. To put that in perspective, this is the strongest monthly growth since November 2022, back when the market was riding a completely different wave. Year on year, prices are up 3.5%, which sounds like fantastic news if you're a homeowner watching your asset appreciate. The housing market index shows demand is climbing, transactions are picking up pace, and there's genuine activity returning to a sector that many wrote off just months ago. Buyers who sat on the sidelines through 2024 are now flooding back into the market, armed with mortgage approvals and ready to compete. But here's where things get complicated. The surge isn't happening in a vacuum. Interest rates have been playing a dangerous game with the property sector. The Bank of England has been walking a tightrope, trying to cool inflation without completely destroying borrowing power. What we're seeing now is a reaction to expectations rather than concrete changes. Mortgage lenders started cutting their rates in anticipation of future Bank of England moves, and that tiny window of opportunity was all it took to unleash pent-up demand. People who've been waiting for affordability to improve suddenly saw fixed-rate deals dropping below 5% and decided to jump. The problem is that these rate cuts weren't based on economic stability improving. They were bets on what might happen next, and bets can go wrong. Consumer confidence has spiked, but for all the wrong reasons. Households aren't necessarily in better financial shape than they were 3 months ago. Real wages are still struggling to keep up with the cost of living. Energy bills remain elevated compared to historical norms. Food prices are still punishing family budgets. Yet somehow, people have convinced themselves that now is the time to take on the biggest debt of their lives. Part of this is psychological. After years of uncertainty, there's a desperate need to believe things are getting better. Part of it is fear of missing out. Nobody wants to watch prices climb while they're stuck renting and unable to get on the ladder. But there's a darker element at play. Many buyers are stretching themselves thinner than ever before, taking on mortgage commitments that leave almost no room for error. One unexpected job loss, one major repair, one shift in interest rates, and thousands of households could find themselves in serious trouble. The regional picture tells a story that national averages hide. Londos and in the southeast are seeing some of the strongest growth, which makes sense given those markets have deeper pockets and more international money flowing through them. But up in the north, in the Midlands, in areas where average incomes are lower and economic prospects less certain, the picture is very different. Properties are moving, but at what cost? First-time buyers in these regions are being forced to compromise on everything. They're buying smaller homes in less desirable areas with longer commutes just to get a foot in the door. The dream of home ownership has become a game of survival rather than aspiration. Meanwhile, buy-to-let investors are circling, snapping up properties that would have gone to families, turning them into rental units that perpetuate the cycle. The wealth gap between homeowners and renters is widening at a rate that should alarm anyone paying attention. Then there's the supply-side crisis that nobody wants to address properly. We're not building enough homes. That's been true for decades, but it's reaching a critical point now. Planning regulations strangle new developments. NIMBY opposition blocks necessary construction. Building costs have soared thanks to material price increases and labour shortages post-Brexit. The government talks about ambitious housing targets, but talk is cheap when delivery remains pathetically inadequate. Every year, we fall further behind the number of homes actually needed, which means every year the imbalance between supply and demand gets worse. This surge in prices isn't a sign of a healthy market. It's a symptom of scarcity. When too many people are chasing too few properties, prices rise regardless of whether people can actually afford them. We're watching affordability deteriorate in real time while celebrating price growth as if it's good news. For young people, for families, for anyone not already on the ladder, this is a disaster dressed up as a recovery. The rental market is another piece of this puzzle that can't be ignored. As house prices climb, more people find themselves locked out of buying, which means rental demand intensifies. Landlords are responding exactly as you'd expect, pushing rents higher and higher. We've just seen average rents hit record levels across most of the UK. In some cities, renters are spending 50% or more of their take-home pay just on housing. That leaves nothing for saving toward a deposit, which means the dream of buying becomes even more distant. It's a vicious cycle that benefits property owners and punishes everyone else. The government's response has been half-hearted at best. Rent controls get discussed and dismissed. Support for first-time buyers comes in the form of schemes that often just inflate prices further. Meanwhile, people are making impossible choices between heating their homes and feeding their families, all while watching property values soar past any reasonable connection to earnings. What happens next is anyone's guess, but the warning signs are flashing red. This price surge is fragile, built on optimism rather than solid economic foundations. If inflation proves more stubborn than expected, if the Bank of England has to keep rates higher for longer, if global economic conditions deteriorate, this whole house of cards could collapse faster than it rose. We've seen it before. The early 90s crash, the 2008 financial crisis. Both were preceded by periods where everyone convinced themselves that this time was different, that prices could only go up. The fundamentals haven't changed, wages haven't suddenly doubled, productivity hasn't miraculously improved. We're essentially just shifting debt around and hoping for the best. For those already stretched thin, even a small uptick in unemployment or a modest increase in mortgage rates could be catastrophic. Repossessions could climb, forced sales could flood the market. The very surge we're seeing now could reverse with brutal speed. The broader economic context makes this situation even more precarious. The UK is facing productivity problems that have plagued us for years. Business investment remains weak. Public services are crumbling under funding pressures. The tax burden is at historic highs, yet public satisfaction with services continues to fall. Brexit trade frictions continue to create unnecessary costs and complications for businesses. Our relationship with our largest trading partner remains fraught with tension and barriers that didn't exist before. Manufacturing is struggling, retail is under pressure from changing consumer habits and squeezed spending power. The only sector that seems to generate consistent wealth is property, which tells you everything about how unbalanced our economy has become. We've turned housing into a speculative asset class rather than a basic human need, and now we're trapped in a system where any significant correction would cause widespread financial pain. Young people are bearing the brunt of this dysfunctional system. The average age of a first-time buyer keeps creeping upward. Increasingly, getting on the property ladder requires family wealth in the form of deposit gifts or guarantors. If your parents can't help, your chances of buying drop dramatically. This isn't about hard work or saving diligently anymore. It's about luck of birth and inheritance. We're creating a society where property ownership becomes hereditary, passed down through families, while everyone else is permanently locked out. The social implications are profound. Home ownership has historically been linked to stability, community investment, and even political engagement. When entire generations are excluded from that, what does it mean for society? Resentment builds. Faith in the system erodes. The compact between citizens and state begins to fracture. The catch that changes everything about this price surge is simple, but devastating. This isn't sustainable growth driven by improving economic conditions or rising living standards. It's a speculative bubble inflating further, driven by cheap credit and fear of missing out. The fundamentals don't support these valuations. The average house price to earnings ratio is completely out of whack with historical norms. In the 1990s, you might expect to pay 3 to 4 times your annual salary for a home. Now, We're looking at ratios of 8, 9, even 10 times earnings in many parts of the country. That's not a market functioning properly. That's a market broken by policy failures, inadequate supply, and a financial system that profits from ever-increasing property values regardless of the social cost. So where does this leave us? If you're already a homeowner, you're watching your wealth increase on paper, but that wealth is locked in bricks and mortar unless you're willing to downsize or relocate. If you're trying to buy, you're facing the impossible choice of stretching yourself dangerously thin or watching the dream slip further away. If you're renting, you're trapped in an increasingly expensive and insecure situation with no clear path out. The system is working exactly as designed for those who benefit from it, and failing spectacularly for everyone else. Policymakers talk about fixing the housing crisis while implementing measures that make it worse. The Help to Buy schemes that inflate demand without addressing supply. The stamp duty holidays that create temporary booms followed by crashes. The planning system that protects property values at the expense of building homes. Every intervention seems designed to keep prices high rather than make housing affordable. The international comparison makes our situation look even worse. Other developed nations have managed to build sufficient housing to meet demand. Other countries have implemented policies that prevent property from becoming purely a speculative investment. We've chosen a different path, one that prioritizes existing homeowners and property investors over first-time buyers and renters. The political calculus is obvious. Homeowners vote more reliably than renters. Older people vote more reliably than younger people. So policies cater to those demographics, even when they're driving long-term economic and social damage. Until that political equation changes, until we collectively decide that housing is too important to be left to market forces that have clearly failed, nothing fundamental will shift. This latest price surge might feel like good news if you're sitting in a property you bought years ago. But zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Look at the debt levels households are taking on. Look at the vulnerability to interest rate changes. Look at the generational divide being carved deeper every month. Look at the distortion in our economy where buying and selling property to each other has become more lucrative than actually making things or providing services. This isn't a sustainable model for a healthy economy. Eventually, something has to give. The question isn't whether this system is broken. The question is, what breaks first? Will it be households defaulting on mortgages they couldn't really afford? Will it be a rental market that finally prices out so many people that political pressure becomes irresistible? Will it be an external economic shock that exposes how fragile our property-dependent economy really is? Nobody knows the exact trigger, but the vulnerabilities are obvious to anyone willing to look past the headline figures. The really troubling part is how normalized this dysfunction has become. We've accepted that young people probably won't own homes until their 30s or 40s. We've accepted that multiple generations might need to live together not by choice, but by necessity. We've accepted that housing costs will consume an ever larger share of household income. We've accepted that geographical mobility will decrease because moving means navigating an impossible property market. We've accepted that businesses will struggle to recruit because workers can't afford to live where the jobs are. These aren't minor inconveniences. These are fundamental problems that undermine economic dynamism and social cohesion. Yet here we are, celebrating a 1.4% monthly price increase as if it's something to cheer about. The mortgage market adds another layer of risk that's being ignored in the celebration of rising prices. Fixed rate deals are temporary. Most people fix for 2 or 5 years, which means they'll eventually face whatever interest rates prevail when their deal ends. Right now, anyone who fixed during the ultra-low rate period of 2020 and 2021 is facing a brutal shock when they remortgage. Monthly payments are doubling or even tripling for some households. That's money that can't be spent in the real economy. That's family holidays cancelled, home improvements postponed, discretionary spending slashed. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of households and you have a significant drag on economic growth. The Bank of England is aware of this mortgage cliff, but their options are limited. They can't keep rates low just to protect over-leveraged homeowners if inflation remains a threat. So we're stuck watching this slow-motion crisis unfold. knowing that many families are heading towards serious financial stress. The political response has been predictably inadequate. Both major parties talk about housing, but neither has presented a credible plan to actually fix the underlying problems. Building targets get announced with fanfare, then quietly missed with barely any accountability. Planning reform gets promised, then watered down to meaninglessness when opposition mobilises. Social housing, which once provided an alternative to the private market, has been decimated over decades of underinvestment and right-to-buy policies that weren't matched with replacement building. The result is a market where private developers have enormous power, building what's profitable rather than what's needed, in locations that suit them rather than where housing is most required. Local authorities lack the funding and power to shape development in their areas. Central government lacks the political will to override local opposition to new building. So we drift along, building far too few homes, watching prices climb, and pretending that somehow market forces will eventually solve a problem that market forces created. What's particularly frustrating is that we know what works. We have examples from our own history and from other countries. Vienna's social housing model, Singapore's approach to public housing, Japan's planning system that actually allows building in response to demand. These aren't mysterious secrets. They're policy choices that prioritise housing as a social good rather than a speculative asset. But implementing any of them would require political courage to stand up to vested interests that profit from the current system. It would require accepting that existing property values might need to moderate rather than continuously increase. It would require thinking beyond the next election cycle to the long-term health of society and economy. Based on current evidence, that kind of transformation seems unlikely, so instead, we'll continue celebrating price surges while ignoring the catch that makes them a curse rather than a blessing. The surge in house prices we're seeing right now is real. The numbers don't lie. But understanding what those numbers actually mean requires looking beyond the surface. This isn't a story of economic recovery or improved affordability. It's a story of a broken system lurching from one crisis to another, creating winners and losers based largely on timing and luck rather than merit or effort. For anyone trying to navigate this market, whether buying, selling, or renting, the key is understanding these deeper dynamics rather than just reacting to headline figures. The catch isn't hidden. It's right there in plain sight for anyone willing to look. House prices are surging, but the foundations underneath are shakier than ever.